What happens when two strong personalities clash live on television and a simple conversation turns into something deeply emotional? The tension in the studio was thick as Jeannie Mai sat across from Sherri Shepherd. The cameras rolled, and the audience could sense that this wasn't going to be a normal interview. What began as a cheerful reunion quickly escalated into one of the most intense and uncomfortable moments in daytime TV. Before we get into it, make sure to subscribe and comment whose side you're on. By the end, everyone will have an opinion. The interview started smoothly. Sherri welcomed Jeannie with a warm hug and the crowd applauded. They had a long history together, both seasoned in the entertainment world and both having faced very public personal struggles. Their bond appeared strong, built on shared experiences. Sherri asked about Jeannie's career, her fashion line, and life as a mom. Jeannie was lively, expressive, and entertaining. But then the tone shifted. Sherri's expression grew serious, and she brought up Jeannie's recent podcast, where she talked about forgiveness and moving on after her divorce, a subject everyone knew had been painful. Jeannie explained that forgiveness can sometimes be misused, that some people demand it to avoid accountability. She spoke about emotional manipulation and how some twist stories to make themselves appear as victims. The audience quieted, sensing the conversation had turned personal. Sherri nodded but seemed unconvinced. She said forgiveness for her was about freeing yourself, not excusing others, and she shared her own experience with her divorce. She explained that letting go helped her heal and move forward. Jeannie replied that forgiveness for some is a tool for others to avoid consequences. Sometimes what people call forgiveness is actually denial, a way to avoid difficult truths. Her voice stayed calm but firm. She said boundaries are just as important as grace. Some audience members clapped, but the tension was clear. Sherri crossed her arms and said it sounded like Jeannie was still carrying pain and letting her ex control her emotions. The words hit hard. Jeannie laughed, but it was disbelief, not amusement. She said Sherri didn't know what happened behind closed doors and questioned why her own healing process wasn't allowed to differ from Sherri's. Sherri raised her voice slightly, insisting she wasn't attacking, only pointing out patterns that might be keeping Jeannie stuck. Jeannie's tone sharpened. She said women are often labeled bitter for expressing anger, and that wasn't a flaw, it was self-protection. The crowd gasped as the conversation turned into confrontation. Jeannie straightened in her chair, stating that Sherri had no right to judge her choices or her journey. She said taking the high road shouldn't mean accepting harm without accountability, and she refused to support a culture that demanded women forgive while men escape consequences. Sherri countered that this wasn't about gender, but about growth and responsibility. She said Jeannie's anger wouldn't bring peace and that real healing involved taking responsibility for her own life. The tension mounted. Jeannie's hands shook slightly, and she said dismissing her anger as performative was exactly what silences women. She said maybe Sherri avoided her own anger because it was easier than facing pain. Sherri looked shocked. She said the discussion had crossed a line, and maybe it was best to end the segment. Jeannie stood abruptly, the audience gasping. She said she agreed. The interview needed to end. She had come for an honest discussion, not to be dissected publicly. Sherri asked her to sit and stop being dramatic, which only strengthened Jeannie's resolve. She said being labeled dramatic was the problem. She was done shrinking to make others comfortable. Looking at the audience, she said this wasn't a meltdown, but an assertion of her boundaries. Sherri stood, saying Jeannie was playing to the cameras, turning the situation into a performance. Jeannie said there was a difference between questions and judgment. The crew scrambled, unsure whether to cut to commercial. Jeannie said Sherri's questions had crossed into controlling her narrative, using the platform for drama. Sherri tried to explain she only wanted to help, but Jeannie said help wasn't what she was feeling. It felt controlling. Sherri's voice trembled as she asked Jeannie to stay and show the audience how friends resolve conflict. Jeannie declined, saying knowing when to walk away is also strength. She picked up her bag, telling the audience that sometimes protecting your peace matters more than pleasing others. Sherri said leaving proved Jeannie couldn't handle conflict, but Jeannie turned back, saying staying in harm wasn't strength. It was self-destruction. True strength, she said, is choosing yourself and protecting your peace. Sherri shook her head, accusing Jeannie of using therapy language to justify shutting people out, claiming every disagreement was now toxic. Jeannie's composure cracked. She said Sherri had used the interview to attack her under the guise of concern. The audience was silent. Sherri said she missed the old Jeannie, the version who trusted and laughed easily. Jeannie said that version was gone, replaced by someone who set boundaries and valued herself. Sherri wiped her eyes, insisting one conversation didn't erase years of friendship. Jeannie smiled sadly and said it revealed Sherri's true colors. She'd rather be alone than surrounded by people who claimed to love her while undermining her. Sherri's face hardened. She said walking away proved Jeannie avoided confrontation, but Jeannie turned one last time, saying choosing peace over performance wasn't weakness, it was self-respect. Jeannie left the stage as the cameras rolled, the audience frozen in a mix of applause and stunned silence. Sherri finally addressed the viewers, voice shaky, saying real conversations can be messy, but even she knew this was more than a messy interview. It was the public ending of a friendship. One of daytime television's most intense moments unfolded live, showing that sometimes even years of closeness can't survive one honest conversation. The question remains, was Jeannie right to walk away, or should she have stayed to try to make peace?